So for this presentation, we're going to be looking at the European use of Expressionism after World War I. So the goals are to understand the intense, realistic post-war Expressionism used by German artists. We're trying to understand the European post-war psyche, the malaise, and the importance of this cathartic subject matter. We're going to examine the new objectivity movement, and then finally explore the Degenerate art show. So I want to open with this image for you. This is a work by Otto Dix called War Cripples from 1920. This painting was originally confiscated by the Nazis in 1937 and considered degenerate art. It was later exhibited in the Entartete Kunst, which is the exhibition of degenerate art that was held in Munich in 1937, and we believe it was later destroyed by the Nazis. So when you're looking at this piece, I want you to take a moment and decide what you're really looking at. What are you seeing here? You may want to pause the video briefly, but clearly you're seeing an image of four people, but who aren't entirely whole, for whatever matter that means. What else do you see though? What else are you able to examine as you walk through each figure individually? Okay, so my hope is that in the first image, you're really seeing that this man is a double amputee using a crutch, sort of walk in front here. He's also missing his right arm, but he's got this flag or this cross on his lapel that indicates he was a German soldier. He's also exposed a piece of his face, right on the left-hand side. You're able to see his teeth exposed, so he's encountered some kind of face laceration. The second figure is even more disfigured than the first. Here we see a man whose face is kind of been shown in a variety of movement. And so we're worried here that he's encountered some kind of massive, maybe chemical weapon exposure. His whole arm here is almost wavy. You're using wavy lines to show how damaged that right hand is. Right? He's also another amputee. He's lost his left leg here. The third individual is smoking. Again, they all sort of have that same banner on their left lapel. But this man is a little bit different. He's being pushed in a wheelchair by the man behind him, right? We only see one of his legs. We're not sure that leg is entirely whole either. So he's actually unable to sort of walk on his own. That's why the wheelchair is present here. He also doesn't have a left arm. We're not sure if he has a right arm, but the left arm has been completely cut here, and the sleeve of his jacket has been altered so that he doesn't actually have sort of a massive amount of fabric. The final man here, again, his teeth are really exposed. That left-hand side of his jaw seems to have some scarring, so it looks like he also encountered some kind of an attack. That one eye, the left eye, is quite large. You can see that kind of darkened, shadowed area underneath the eye that looks like it's helping to sort of indicate that there was a trauma that was encountered with that eye. So you're looking at a group of men who are all disfigured in some way. Even that man pushing the walker, that left hand is kind of skeletal looking, right? It doesn't look like it has a ton of flesh covering the hand. And so these are men returning from war, walking what clearly is in a street in front of some shops behind them. So what is this piece all about? This has to do with the German losses in World War I. So the interwar period is about the idea that Germans held on to the notion that Germany was still really glorious and victorious, even despite losing in World War I. Most of the men came home with tons of physical and psychological injury, and the people of Germany suffered tons of loss through the war. We talked about that in the last slideshow. So the country was struggling with its identity in the wake of its defeat. Otto Dix, the artist of that first piece, was so critical of the German military, its citizens and soldiers, because they all appeared to relish in the chance to redefine themselves as heroes and to restore their national pride. Another war provided for another opportunity to reconcile their conflicting identities. So that will be World War II actually is a way for Germany to take back some of this ownership about their national pride. So in showing the soldiers of work cripples as ruined individuals, Dix is declaring that there is no glory in war, only death, destruction, and decay. War would not afford them the outcome they so desired. Like the cripples within the painting, Germany and many of its citizens blindly marched on, forgetting the source of their disintegration in the first place. So this week we're going to look at a couple different artists who are working in this new objectivity period, which is really a social commentary on the loss that the German citizens encountered during World War I and the artistic reaction to that loss. So our first artist is going to be Kathe Kollwitz, and I want to show you some of the prints that she is most recognized for. So this first piece is called The Mothers. This is plate 6 from her series War, which is also called Krieg in German. And the date for this is about 1921 to 1922. So the portfolio includes 7 woodcuts with a woodcut cover, and I'm just going to show you a few of these. But when you look at this piece at first, before I tell you anything about it, my hope is that you can see the simplicity in this piece, right? Just the black and white format here. And clearly this is called The Mothers. This is a group of women who are embracing themselves or each other, right? Creating kind of a huddle. There's a few children who are poking their faces out that I'm sure you're able to see. But what you're not getting from the women is a lot of happiness for this embrace, right? They look very sad. Their eyes are kind of vacant and they're staring off into space in these different directions. So let's talk a little more about The Mothers. So in 1919, Kathe Kollwitz began work on Krieg. This is her response to the tragedies endured during what she called the unspeakably difficult years of World War I and its aftermath. So again, the portfolio that she worked on includes 7 woodcuts that focus on the sorrow of the people who were left behind in the war. So you're thinking of mothers, of widows, and of the children. She had struggled to find the appropriate means of expression until she actually saw an exhibition of Ernst Barlach and his woodcuts in 1920. So we're going to look at some of his pieces a little bit later, but just keep that in mind, that her early work was different than this, but by the 1920s, she'd really kind of started to refine her style to woodblock prints. And she really is revising each of these prints through as many as 9 preparatory drawings and states where she's radically simplifying the compositions. Again, she's using a large format, these stark black and white woodcuts here featuring women left to face their grief and their fears alone, without their partners, but with each other to sort of depend on. So another piece from this is The Parents. This is plate number 3 from her War series. What you see here are 2 sobbing individuals who are embracing each other in the devastation of likely the loss of a child. Another piece is The Sacrifice. This is plate number 1 actually from this. So you're seeing a woman here give away or hand up an infant right into what looks like a sky or some kind of a brighter abyss beyond herself, offering sort of the child as in service to a greater good. And then one final plate from this series is plate 5. This is known as The Widow. And again, this is a woman who's lying on the floor, it looks like, right? You're able to see kind of wood grain where maybe she's laying on a floor. And she's embracing a child here who looks to be probably sleeping. I'm not sure the child is deceased here. But this woman is absolutely horrified at the pain that she's encountering. One other work from this same series, The War, is her piece called The Volunteers. This is plate number 2. Just to give you a little bit of background, she was originally trained as a painter, but by 1890 turned to printmaking for this means of social criticism. She was married to a physician, and she was part of one of these kind of prominent families in Berlin, and she felt a lot of deep admiration for the working class, and she decided to dedicate her art to the poor and the oppressed within German society, especially women and children. Ultimately, she was devastated by the death of her younger son, Peter, who died in combat in 1914. He led her to embrace a more pacifism in her life, and she concentrated increasingly on themes of sacrifice and mourning in her work after she lost him. She's stylistically indebted to a naturalistic style, right? So the people here look relatively realistic but simple, and again, she began to eventually simplify her compositions to emphasize the emotion. She made a total of 275 prints, nearly all of which are in black and white. She focused on etching until about 1911 and then turned more to lithography, and capitalized on this directness and the immediacy of the medium. And she thought this was especially important for posters supporting post-war humanitarian causes. So I want to look at the volunteers just a little bit more briefly. In this print, it actually shows combatants from the war, so it's different than those others, which were the mothers and the mother and husband kind of brief images. But in it, Kollwitz's younger son, Peter, is actually placed next to death, right? So death is at that far left, sort of has that, what looks like a scream kind of mask here. So he's placed next to death, and death is leading these troops into a procession, basically to war. So you see all of these men kind of following here. And they seem to be hurrying, right? The images at the bottom, the lines that she's really used sort of elevate this sense of movement of people. Peter was killed in action just 2 months after he joined the war. And Kollwitz wanted these works to be able to be widely viewed. As many of you know, woodcuts can be quickly replicated and printed, and so they're able to be mass-produced and disseminated more quickly. By eliminating references to a specific time or place, she created universally legible indictments of the real sacrifices these men had made, and she demanded an exchange for abstract concepts of honor and glory for these sacrifices. The prints were exhibited in 1924 at a newly founded museum in Berlin, supported the international anti-war movement. And we're going to look at one other piece that cafe. Another piece by Kollwitz was Never Again War from 1924. This piece is, again, her commitment to the causes of the working class and pursuing social change, primarily through the printmaking medium because of its potential to reach a wide audience. Never Again War is an image of her passionate protest. And so it's filled with this political and personal imagery in her work, particularly because her son had passed away from the war. In general, the World War I experience had filled German artists with a deep anguish at the state of modern civilization. And one of these principal outlets for dealing with their anguish was the Expressionist movement. So again, Kollwitz's work is deeply devoted to themes of inhumanity and injustice, these social and ethical concerns. She has an intensely expressive and naturalistic style, a bleakness of the subject matter. Images of these gaunt mothers and exploited workers fill her canon. And again, they're mostly these passionate images protesting war. So Kollwitz and the Nazi Party have a long history. So she became the first woman elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts in 1919. After the war, Kollwitz created many of these lithographs of women and children. The first image you're seeing on the right here is bread. And the second image will be this hungry children image, right? And they were widely popular and circulated throughout the country. And she intended to draw attention to the starving working class and the impact of World War I on the nation. Later, she was actually expelled by the Nazis, who prohibited her from exhibiting, but actually they appropriated her images for their own propaganda. So on the next page, I'm going to show you how they use those two images. During World War II, though, her Berlin apartment was actually destroyed with great loss to her body of work, and she ended up dying 2 weeks before the German surrender. So the use of Kollwitz's work, so again, the two images you're seeing on the left here were that bread and the hungry children image, and those were reprinted almost a decade later during World War II. So World War II saw the printing of bread in a nationalist socialist women's magazine, Warta, as pro-Nazi propaganda with the forged signature of St. Frank. And Kollwitz was outraged as she was a staunch opponent of Nazism and another world war. The U.S. actually appropriated the hungry children image as propaganda for encouraging people to accept rationing as part of the war effort. So that image is, ask the women and children whom Hitler is starving whether rationing is too great a sacrifice. So again, it's an incredible sort of appropriation of Kollwitz's work for pro-war propaganda that, again, she was ultimately incredibly outraged by. So the next artist we're going to see is Marsden Hartley, and truthfully, this work falls kind of in more of a Cubist genre, but I put it in this Expressionism PowerPoint because I want to emphasize the symbolic meaning that can be associated with works that took place kind of in this World War I movement. So this is Portrait of a German Soldier from 1914. Again, it falls more under Cosmic Cubism or German Expressionism, but it doesn't literally represent a physical human subject, but it speaks symbolically of a human subject through the use of numbers and fragments of German military paraphernalia and the insignias. So what you're seeing here is a black background, which is quite formal, truthfully, but it intensifies all the colors that are being used kind of in the foreground here, and the expressive qualities of those colors. In general, the artist was enamored with this soldier, and the geometric shapes and the symbolic meaning are about sort of his love for this man. They also symbolize kind of his love for chess and some other ideas. So we're going to look more closely at this in the next slide. So this was actually portrayed in the U.S. at Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery in New York, so that's why it sometimes falls under sort of an early American movement. In 1912, Hartley traveled to Europe. He visited Paris and saw Cubist artworks. He visited Munich and he saw the Der Blaue Reiter movement. And he developed his own style that he called Cosmic Cubism. In 1913, he went to Berlin. Again, this is right before World War I in 1914, so there's a lot of heightened militarism in Germany leading up to the war. Hartley himself immersed his own psyche in military imagery and learned about the German flags and different sort of regional flags. Like here you're seeing the blue and the white sort of checkerboard or diagonal patterns as the Bavarian home flags, and different regimental insignias or badges and emblems. So this is in general a reference to his lover, Lieutenant Karl von Freiburg. And Hartley and Freiburg had an intimate relationship. Freiburg was honored and awarded with the Iron Cross, which is shown in the upper triangle, the Black Iron Cross here posthumously. So he was killed at age 24 in battle a few months before this image was painted. So you're able to see a 24 in that lower right-hand area in the yellow. Freiburg's initials are on the lower left, that KVF. The letter E and the number 4 are in the center, and they represent his regiment in the Bavarian Eisenbahn. And this is the influence of synthetic cubism. So remember that flattened representation of elements, almost abstracted patterns. It seems to have kind of a collage effect, right? So things feel stacked and layered here. And again, that somber black background really casts sort of a gloom over the whole painting. And so this is his tribute to to the fallen German officer who he loved. So the next piece is going to be a work by Raoul Hausmann, and we're going to talk a little bit about dysfunctional machines and how those can be interpreted. So the idea of dysfunctional machines or automatons, sort of robotic individuals, can be read as a pessimistic response to the celebration of science and power and technology that had been experienced before World War I. In general, the post-war generation lost a lot of faith in civilization and technology and progress. Remember, machine guns, those howitzers, the airplanes, the advent of chemical weapons, all of those led to a mass destruction of people and humanity. So people were far more wary of machine after the war than they were before. This piece by Hausmann is called The Spirit of Our Time from 1919. And before I read anything, I want you to stop and look at this image and see what you can really tease out of this, right? We've got a mannequin face here, right? We've got eyes and a nose and a mouth that have been carved into it, but we've got sort of a long strip down the center of the forehead. We've got a number 22. We've got all these other kind of machine parts assembled onto this head. So this is supposed to be a caricature of the mindless bourgeoisie citizen who followed their leaders into war. Hausmann said that the average German, quote, has no more capabilities than those which chance has glued on the outside of his skull. His brain remains empty. Again, you can sort of put all of these things onto a skull, but the brain itself is empty. So when we look closer at this, again, Jonathan Jones here writing for The Guardian, but he wrote, "Dead of eye and moronic of mouth, the head is given identity only by the object stuck to it. A tape measure, a wooden ruler, a tin cup, a spectacles case, and a piece of metal, which could be a plate plugging the damaged skull of a soldier. If this is a mechanical head, the prototype for humanity becomes robotic. It is crude. A Frankensteinian early experiment in which the emotions and the soul survive only as a heart shape engraved on the empty tin cup." So again, a really pessimistic view of people and unfortunately how people are kind of put back together in some way, right? This Frankenstein kind of experiment of how to rehab men coming home from this war in 1918. So this piece was made only a year later. So George Grosz is a famous Dada artist who also is working in this new objectivity movement. And so we're going to look at several pieces by Grosz and his sort of social commentary. Again, he's part of the Berlin Dada movement, but he's often focusing on portraying the grim social and economic devastation of Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany is referred to as that interwar period. So here you're seeing Gray Day from 1921, and you're seeing men kind of going to work in the factories behind them, right? The man directly sort of behind the front character here has clearly lost, looks like his right arm, right? At some level, at least his hand. He's using a walking stick on the left. And we've got a character in front of him, right? So we know that that man has gone to war and has lost a limb and is kind of coming back. He's got a lot of scars on his face, the kind of projecting forward teeth. But the man in front of him has this cross-eyed expression, right? And he looks goofy. He's got a very rounded head. He's kind of chubby, right? He's got a kind of a double chin and this collar that's kind of not helping that whole double chin effect. But he's got a briefcase and he's clearly heading to work. He's in a beautiful suit. And he seems oblivious to the wall and the destruction and the state of the man behind him. And that's really the point here, right? Trying to call attention to the oblivious bourgeoisie culture in relationship to that grim and economic devastation piece behind him. Another piece by Grosz is this Fit for Active Service, The Faith Healers from 1916 to 1917. If you look quickly at this piece, my hope is that you're kind of centered on that central figure with the Iron Cross on his jacket here. on saying the letters KV, but he's actually looking at a decaying skeleton. So this doesn't totally make sense, right, at first. But let's look a little more deeply at this piece. So again, this work is known by its title, Fit for Active Service, and it depicts a doctor inspecting a skeleton with an ear trumpet and pronouncing him KV, which is really short for this long German word, which means fit for combat. He seems unconcerned with the diagnosis, and he's surrounded by officers who appear either bored or absorbed in other matters, right? You see those first two people in particular in the foreground, and they're kind of laughing and looking at each other. And then the men kind of on the side table who appear totally disinterested. The scene refers to the desperate recall of discharged soldiers toward the end of the war after the German forces had suffered heavy losses. So again, this was made 1916 to 1917. The war didn't end until 1918. So this is actually talking about men who were returning to the front. Gross himself had been forced to return to the front in 1917, only to be released 4 months later for mental illness, lending the subject a great deal of personal significance, right? How could you not if you're a soldier returning to battle and you're not fit for service? Gross's penchant for grotesque imagery is indebted to the precedent set by the German Gothic tradition, which he often looked back to as a source of inspiration. He's also best known for his drawings and works on paper, and The Faith Healers is an exemplary example of his work. It's highly politically charged, and it overlaps with these ideas of both the New Objectivity movement and the Berlin Dada group. So going back a little bit to those automatons and dysfunctional machines, George Gross was also a proponent of kind of showing people with that robotic nature, or the reconstructed man kind of imagery. So automatons and dysfunctional machines were a common part or a common theme of Dada art. Let's look a little more closely at this piece. In Republican Automatons, Gross ridiculed the German middle classes as a mindless flag-waving automaton, right? So that guy on the left waving the sort of German flag of yellow, red, and black. They're incapable of questioning the direction Germany was going. Not surprisingly, George Gross was forced to flee Germany when the Nazis came to power, and shortly after he left, they confiscated his work. So this and 2 other paintings ended up in the Museum of Modern Art's collection in New York, but recently heirs of Gross's estate have sued the museum for repossession of the work. This is only one example of many lawsuits that involve works in public museums now that were originally taken and confiscated by the Nazis. So this happens quite frequently, and I know many people can be interested in the repossession of especially German Jewish artists and the rightful descendants to those works today. Another part of his canon was satirizing the ruling elite and the emerging Nazi party. So this is Pillars of Society. This is from 1926, and what you're going to see are kind of different levels of mockery within this piece we'll work through. So in this picture, a Nazi holds a beer mug and a sword. So we've got this Nazi soldier in the foreground here, right? You can see on his tie the insignia. Again, beer in his left hand, clearly holding a sword in his right. He is unharmed, or what feels like unharmed either by his limbs from the war, but he's got sort of, a redness to his face that indicates he may have either been in battle, or he's got sort of some scars that we're seeing here. His head is open or flipped open to reveal a heroic soldier on horseback. So this noble tradition of warfare that had become obsolete in World War I, but that still really echoes a time of different type of warfare. Surrounding him are fat members of the bourgeoisie, right, the upper class, one of whom on the left is holding a newspaper. Again, he sort of looks cross-eyed, which is a common reference to the lack of understanding in that class. He's got a teacup upside down in his head. He's got a blood-stained feather in his arms here, and the newspapers themselves sort of have what look like blood on them. The other man waves a German flag, and his head actually is open and it reveals a steaming pile of excrement or poop, right? So you're seeing that kind of white imagery of steam coming off of his head here. In the background, there are more German soldiers that are what look like terrorizing a city as it goes up in flames. A pro-Nazi priest on the left is welcoming these people with open arms, right? Calling them into this battle or into this siege. So again, Gross is portraying the grim social and economic devastation of Weimar Germany, and it's satirizing the ruling elite. It's no wonder people didn't like these images who were in power. This was essentially a denunciation of militarism, the press, a corrupt clergy, monarchists and nationalists. All were depicted running around like headless, brainless chickens, and yet despite this, they were the ruling class, still active in warmongering activities. Another piece that I like is this dedication to Oscar Paniza. This was a massive work, and it was meant to kind of overwhelm the viewer with this really chaotic imagery. So it's dedicated to the writer and psychiatrist Oscar Paniza, who was known for his witty criticisms against the state. A funeral is a statement of Gross's feelings of disgust and frustration toward German society during the tumultuous period that followed World War I. So again, this is 1917 to 1918, kind of arising at the end of the war. The chaotic procession of distorted figures painted in shades of dark red and black seems to take place in a hellish chasm between precariously slanted buildings, right? So these buildings look like they're about to fall down in the background. There's this entirely chaotic scene in the foreground. The dense collage-like technique draws from Cubism and Futurism, and it adds to the sense of claustrophobia by layering multiple scenes in a shallow space. In a letter, Gross described his composition as a, quote, gin alley of grotesque dead bodies and madmen, a teeming throng of possessed human animals. Think that wherever you step, there's the smell of shit. This vivid description conveys Gross's passionate opposition against the direction of the German administration following World War I. The synthesis of inspiration from both modern and traditional sources is typical of Gross's work, as well as that of the larger New Objectivity movement. So another artist we're going to look more closely at is Otto Dix. This is familiar because we first saw that War Cripples piece as our first image for the entire slideshow. So again, let's revisit War Cripples a little bit more and talk a little bit more briefly about what this piece represents and what it shows. So again, War Cripples involves war veterans in full military dress marching along a city street. Such horrifically maimed and disfigured men were far from uncommon in Germany after World War I, when 80,000 amputees returned home from the front. Relying on prosthetics, canes, and crutches, these veterans have become as mechanized as the war that claimed their flesh. Yet even while depicting the tragic results of the conflict, Dix imbues the work with caustic humor. The veterans are passing a shoemaker, identified by the boot in the shop window, and the word Schuhmacherei, a service for which, thanks to the war, they now have very limited needs. So let's look back at that piece. Here's the work again, right? Those men kind of lining up, and clearly there's actually sort of an arm pointing to the boot and that German word above it in the far back right-hand corner. So this work saw a number of dry point etchings and sort of a series of images before it was actually fully reproduced. And so the Museum of Modern Art has a number of these drawings. This is the most famous, and you can see sort of the similarities, right, in the four individuals, the second individual who has sort of that waviness to his entire head and left arm here, the bootmaker in the background, right, that same kind of head, the mannequin kind of head in the center, that makes a mockery of the fact that none of their faces are entirely perfect or whole anymore. So, he worked on a number of smaller images before he made sort of the more massive piece that is War Cripples. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about War Cripples from 1920 and review some of the main ideas. So War Cripples was the first in a provocative series by the same title by Dix. This was exhibited in the first International Dada Fair in Berlin in 1920. The painting only escaped protest due to the other more controversial works that were actually being displayed alongside it. So the image itself contains 4 male figures arranged in a frieze-like fashion along the canvas, each proudly donning their military uniforms and war wounds as they parade along the street. All are cripples, missing limbs from their time of service in the Great War. Bearing the scars of battle, their features are crude and distorted. Paint is applied upon the canvas with a precise line that emphasizes the angularity of the figures and their mechanical movements. Furthermore, it creates a space filled with figures and shapes that are inherently flat, recalling the film sets of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And this is a film still of Dr. Caligari from 1920, so the same exact time period. As for the painting's color palette, little is known because it disappeared shortly after its appearance in the Degenerate art exhibit in 1937. So here you're actually seeing 2 men standing next to this piece. Clearly I do not own the rights to this piece, but I've had trouble figuring out the exact dimensions, and so I wanted you to see it in person because it's not a small work. It's definitely a monumental piece that you're created with the size of these figures, right? You can see the size, especially of the standing man at the far right with the man standing in the foreground there. So it's got to be at least 5.5, 6 feet tall. So in War Cripples, Dix created a powerful statement against the deluded self-image of the German people and its, quote, pitifully maimed soldiers here. So men are coming into contact with these deformed, maimed figures. I saw this image too online as a general idea of what the color images may have been from this piece, and I liked the idea of showing you this, to show kind of that dull green taupe color of their uniforms, the black of the Iron Cross, the insignia, but also the flesh, the fleshiness of their faces and their arms and all of the disfigurement that we're able to see in this piece. So Dix painted the veterans of War Cripples as ruined, grotesque men, more machine than human, either by hobbling on their peg legs or pushed along in wheelchairs. The men proudly march the German streets, unaware that they are not the glorious heroes they perceive themselves to be. Yet the soldiers happily march on, blinded by their pride. Furthermore, the figural composition recalls the friezes of ancient Greece, filled with the idealized forms of classical gods and men. So here I'm showing you a detail of a frieze from the Parthenon in Athens, which dates to 447 BCE. And this will make sense because at the end of this presentation, I want to show you the Degenerate Art Museum and the works that were part of the Nationalist Socialist Party, which emphasize a more idealized or classical form as opposed to this new objectivity movement that looks at sort of dehumanized figures in some way. So by creating this thematic contrast in War Cripples, this German expressionism versus Greek idealism, Dix forces the German viewer to reconcile the difference between the heroes of old and the heroes of new. In doing so, he creates a scathing indictment of post-war society. No one was safe from his commentary in this painting. So Dix was attacking all of the following groups in his work, War Cripples. He attacked the military for butchering his generation, the public for its fascination with these pathetic, reconstituted veterans, but also the cripples themselves for their undiminished national pride. Other artists were attacking similar groups of individuals in this post-war expressionist movement. Fellow artist Ernst Kirchner painted himself as a symbol of the sickness that overcame Germany following the war in this self-portrait as an invalid. You can see here he's got sort of a bed behind him, right? That's that really green color, but he has sort of a sombering effect and a glaze over his eyes that's hard to distinguish. So Dix uses the wounded soldiers and war cripples as a metaphor for the dangers of the country's national pride. So as our final slide for war cripples, Dix received notoriety for his ability to turn a, quote, clinical eye on the world and record its misery and pain with unreserved accuracy. This is particularly evident from his painting War Cripples. By this time, he felt repelled by the sight of ex-soldiers exposing their deformations in the street. They became for him a symbol of the disillusionment engendered by the war, which he had initially greeted with such bull-necked aggression in 1914. Now all the hopes of renewal through destruction had vanished, and the enraged Dix devoted most of his energy in 1920 to an obsessive, savage, and immensely disturbing sequence of war cripple paintings. So another work by Otto Dix is The Match Seller from 1920. So this is from the same series that depicts a war veteran selling matches on a Dresden street. From the Stuttgart Staatsgalerie. Using a drastically pointed visual language, Dix protests in these works against the senselessness and brutality of war. In this painting, the center of focus is not a group of figures, but rather a single mangled war casualty, presented as a kind of anti-hero. All of the abominable misery of this wounded creature. He is a blind quadruple amputee, but they're concentrating on his large head that's turned obliquely to one side, his eyes concealed behind black eye patches. Immediately behind the head is a cross formed by a wooden door, an allusion to the man's martyrdom. From his mouth, like a tortured outcry, come the words matches, genuine Swedish matches, scratched in chalky oil paint on the canvas. Wealthy passers-by, perhaps war profiteers, flee the presence of the dehumanized figure, made an outcast by their horrified response. Even the dachshund in the foreground expresses his contempt in unmistakable fashion by actually peeing on the amputated legs of this individual. The view from above, the surface-oriented picture book quality, and the collage-style technique employed here using real found objects, the banknotes in the box, and the shreds of newspaper in the gutter intensify the drastic verism of the scene, or the truthfulness of the scene. So again, look at this piece closely. You're really able to see the beautiful shoes of the people who are walking by him. You're only exposed to their legs, right? And so at some level, having both of one's legs is evidence that they weren't involved in the war, that they may have had enough money that they didn't have to go be part of the war effort. And this man, who's quite elderly at this point, right? He's got terrible lines in his face and in his forehead, few teeth in his mouth, and tattered clothing. But again, this quadruple amputee, it doesn't look like he has either arms or legs, is sitting on the street, having served the German people who are abandoning him in this scene. So more of Otto's works, like this one, The Trench, kind of continue to show the horrors of the war. This work to move further away from expressionism and more into this harsh realism that really characterized the new objectivity movement. Eventually, Dix moved almost exclusively into war imagery as Germany moved closer to the 10th anniversary of the onset of the Great War, so by 1924. The country was at its most volatile point, following the riots between the communists and the right-wing respondents at the inauguration of the National Cenotaph, which commemorated the lost people from the war. So controversy over Dix's graphic war scene, The Trench, also reached its nationwide climax. Dix had painted an image of the real war within the trenches, the war that Germany had lost, the war in which so many lives had been destroyed, not the war people sitting by their cozy stoves had dreamt of or idealized. Both events, quote, demonstrated that even as a semblance of cohesion was unattainable, as Germany was unable to grasp with its defeat or responsibility in the Great War. Again, this is another scene. This is the war, 1929 to 1932. So this is moving ahead in time a little bit as we inch towards World War II. And I want you to notice a couple things about this scene. This is what's known as or referred to as a triptych, and this is immediately reminiscent of sort of grand history paintings that are associated with the Renaissance, and particularly the German Renaissance that you'll see on the next page. But the scene here itself is a gruesome battle that's been waged with fire and death and destruction and chaos and men wearing masks and bodies that have been upturned and shot full of ammunition and blood, and a landscape that's been entirely destroyed kind of in that central background scene, but men kind of marching on the left. We don't see their faces. They're part of this mass of individuals that are the war effort, but in the anonymity of war. But clearly this is meant to be a powerful piece. So Dix was extremely affected by his experiences from the war, and he returned to them often for inspiration. So the war shows men going into battle, and it shows the aftermath of the conflict, and it shows them returning from the field. So Dix studied the old masters in both their subject matter and painting methods. So this triptych is immediately reminiscent of grand history paintings such as the German Renaissance artist Matthias Grunewald and his Isenheim altarpiece, which I just pulled up on the top right, from 1506 to 1515. It's also reminiscent, just to go back, the Isenheim altarpiece here, you can see why the triptych format here, right? The multiple panels that open out to show a scene inside, the death of Christ sort of at the center of that Isenheim altarpiece parallels with the death of all of these men in the central panel. The war piece by Dix is slightly different because the scene is spread sort of more throughout the three panels, and the scene above in the Isenheim is clearly very different. But in general, that lowest pane that actually shows the dead bodies kind of lying horizontally also is similar. The other piece that it's referencing is Monteneg's Dead Christ, which is an excellent image of foreshortening here, but you're able to see the wounds that Christ encountered here, and the lying prone of this body, which they say is really evoked in the lowest panel, showing the dead soldiers in Dix's piece. Again, there are strong associations with sacrifice and these apocalyptic war images throughout his work. So this piece by Dix is called The Scat Players, Card Playing with War Invalids from 1920. This is an oil and collage on canvas again, and so it's really showing both his Dada and Cubist influences here. So this is clear because he's really using the collage technique, which was used in both Dada and Cubist pieces. And he's making a clear social statement with his bold technique in this painting. So the Scat Players are war veterans that have been horribly disfigured and crippled by their service, similar to the war cripple painting we've looked at quite a bit. At some level, these individuals are even more destroyed than other people, right? So the one man has lost his arm and is playing cards with his foot here on the left, and when you're really looking at some of the other bodies, the one on the right actually doesn't have any legs at all. And so the Scat game is really still about the fact that they're able to play cards despite these crippling disabilities. And Scat was a card game favored by Krups, the German manufacturer of weapons. So this is something that they were a proponent of. Dix uses the repetition of the cards here and the chair legs and the stumped limbs of the men to build a composition that is disturbing in form as well as content. So just take another moment here to really look over this image and see what else you're really able to see. The mechanized kind of hands here, the jawline that has been totally reconfigured with bound or what feel like assembled robotic pieces. The figure at the center actually uses his teeth to play with the cards. So this is another interesting image about wartime and the disfigurement of people coming home. One final piece by Otto Dix is this Dr. Meyer Hermann. Meyer Hermann was a renowned throat specialist who Otto Dix actually went to see. And his waiting room was often filled with really prominent singers and actresses. Dix is best known for his unflinching depictions of these disabled war veterans, occasionally prostitutes, and other traumatized subjects. But here he's actually using an established professional, but some wit and satire here. What do I mean by that? Basically, the abundance of circular shapes that fill the canvas parody the doctor's body and face. So in the same way that George Grosz was showing those kind of heavier set German men with these double chins and collars that kind of fill out their double chin and make them big and round, they're very different than those emaciated figures of the disabled veterans that are coming home after the war. So here, all those circular shapes parody the doctor's round body and face, the curves of his chubby hands and the round bags under his eyes, to the reflector on his head and his headband and the mirror above and behind his head. So I just wanted you to see that there are other pieces that he's really doing, but there's still a continued emphasis on satire and trying to show the subject with some realism. Okay, so our next artist is Ernst Barlach. Again, he was a proponent of the war leading up to the war, but his participation in the war made him change his position. Well, he's best known for his sculptures protesting the war. So in the years before World War I, he was a patriotic, enthusiastic supporter of the war, and his support for the war can be seen in some of his really early works from 1914. But basically, he volunteered to join the war between 1915 and 1916 as an infantry soldier. After about 3 months of service, he was discharged due to a heart ailment, and he returned as a pacifist and a staunch opponent of the war. The horror of the war influenced all of his subsequent works, and he continued to be a pacifist the rest of his life. This created a lot of conflicts during the rise of the Nazi Party, when most of his works were also confiscated as degenerate art. So this is The Avenger from 1914. Again, this is one of the early works that can really be seen as supporting the war. Here, a man rushing into battle, wielding a weapon, but he is a sculptor, so this piece is in bronze. Okay. So this is another piece. This is War Monument from 1927. This was a commission for a church in Güstrow where he lived in seclusion most of his life following the war. This was installed in 1927, and it's a bronze casting that's almost 2 meters long and is suspended over the baptismal. And it depicts an angel with his arms folded and eyes closed, hovering above the heads of humanity. The expression on the angel's face is one of deep compassion, felt by this otherworldly being for the human beings below who are inflicting so much pain on one another. So recollection and inner reflection was the proper attitude for a war memorial to inspire, Barlach said. The fascinating thing about this war monument is that while he was modeling the angel's head, Barlach became aware that it actually resembled fellow artist Kathy Kollwitz, who we started the presentation with. So Kollwitz was 3 years older than Barlach, and we mentioned that she was also really impressed by his printing techniques. And so Barlach was, or Kollwitz was also associated with the secession movement, though neither was particularly interested in being described as a movement artist. So even though she was opposed to the war, Kollwitz had given permission to her youngest son, who was underage, to join the army, and again, 10 days after he had enlisted, the boy was killed, and Kollwitz was devastated by this grief and guilt. So here, we're really seeing her be sort of immortalized on this angel war monument. So Barlach's work was officially declared degenerate and non-German. In 1938, authorities seized works exhibited by Barlach and Kollwitz, and later that year, Barlach's heart actually gave out and he passed away. After the Second World War ended, Barlach's work was brought out of hiding, so the Güstrow Angel, seen at the left again, was placed back in Cologne. Güstrow asked for its return, but that city was in the east, and the angel became a Cold War issue. So in 1953, Cologne made another casting, this time from a mold prepared from their copy, and presented it to Güstrow, where it regained its place over the baptismal font. So every year on the anniversary of the angel's removal, the church observes a ceremony where members silently recollect and reflect on the past. which is a really fascinating piece of this artwork. So finally, I want to concentrate on the Degenerate art exhibit. So Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, or the Nazi Party, came to power in Germany in 1933. Promising to build a master race cleansed of, quote, degenerates, Hitler launched a campaign to eradicate modern art and to restore a more traditional style of realism based on classical models. In 1937, he ordered the confiscation of all works of modern art from German museums. All art that did not correspond to the National Socialist aesthetic was considered, quote, degenerate. This expansive category included modern and avant-garde works by the Expressionists, Impressionists, Surrealists, and the Fauves, works by artists of Jewish descent, and socially critical works, such as those by Kathy Kollwitz. So there are several documents that I've linked here that I think are good readings to help emphasize the Degenerate art exhibit. This is a guidebook cover to the Degenerate art exhibition that was held in Munich in 1937. All the confiscated works were actually placed on display in Munich in an exhibition titled Entartete Kunst, or Degenerate art. Many of the works were considered degenerate because they were influenced by cultures deemed racially inferior by the Nazis. So this is a historical photo showing Adolf Hitler and Adolf Ziegler visiting the Degenerate art exhibit. So you can see in the background some of the works that look like pieces we've already been seeing in this class, that don't have sort of that same classical idealism that was so admired by the Nazi Party. So the exhibition displayed works that were deemed insulting to the religion, the state, or the German people. They were produced by Jews and other minorities, or there was evidence of foreign and degenerate influences such as modernism and expressionism, African culture, homosexuality, and communism. Pieces were crammed chaotically together in the exhibition space, alongside derogatory graffiti-style comments and notes about how much the state had spent to obtain them. Among the 650 works were works by Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, Marc Chagall, George Grosz, Mondrian, Kandinsky, and Paul Klee. Entartete Kunst became, quote, the first traveling blockbuster show of the 20th century, touring for 2 years across Germany and Austria and attracting 3 million visitors. 1938 also saw the opening of a sister exhibition, Degenerate Music, which targeted modern styles such as jazz. This is a historic photo from the Dada wall in the Degenerate art exhibition in Munich in 1937, and you can see all of the written graffiti next to these pieces. This is another image from the exhibition in Munich. Again, you can see all of the works that have this really strong Cubist influence or ideas of modernism and influence of other cultures. There's a few more, lots of portraits. Lots of paintings that should feel roughly familiar, but all of these people clearly looking at these works in their degenerate kind of light. Another piece, these are men hanging these works. So works that we've seen today from the Degenerate art exhibit are the one on the right, the Otto Dix War Cripples, 45% fit for service. Again, it was lost or destroyed after the exhibition. The other piece is the Reunion by Ernst Barlach. I didn't show you this earlier, but it's a mahogany wood carving, and it's another piece that was part of this exhibition. In the same year as the Entartete Kunst opened, the Haus der Deutschen Kunst, or the House of German Art, was also opened, and it displayed Nazi-approved artworks. So every year from 1937 to 1944, the House of German Art in Munich hosted a so-called Great German Art Exhibition to highlight art that embodied the National Social aesthetic and worldview. Invariably, the works on view included heroic representations of healthy Aryan bodies and Nordic landscapes. Each show also featured a new portrait of Hitler and a representation of the German state symbol, the eagle. There's an excellent video on YouTube through the Khan Academy that talks about this House of German Art and the Entartete Kunst exhibition. So I encourage you to go and watch that piece when you're actually able to view the slideshow. The official style of the Nazi regime was called National Socialist Realism, which was characterized by a realistic style based on academic tradition and the subjects that celebrated the honorable virtues of the German Volk. So Nazi art also drew upon classical idealism to portray Hitler's imagined master race, and Nazi architecture also drew heavily on classical models. So Hitler saw architecture as an instrument of propaganda, and classical architecture proclaimed Germany as the racial heir to ancient Greece and Rome. So this is Hitler actually walking through the House of German Art in 1937, so you're seeing him on the left. And the works that are shown behind him are radically different than those earlier pieces that you saw in the Entartete Kunst or Degenerate art exhibition. So these are far more naturalistic images. They are people who look to be impoverished, but not necessarily to the same degree of abstraction or modernism as the other pieces. The work on the right, clearly these are also members of the Nazi Party with the characteristic swastika on their uniforms. And the pieces behind them are giant landscapes or large buildings and other pieces. The Great Exhibition of German Art featured things like Arno Brecker's decathlon athlete on the left, 1936 bronze sculpture that has clearly this idealized perfect body proportions and looks nothing like those workable pieces we've been used to seeing, right? The view of the sculpture gallery exhibited in the House of German Art. There's another photograph here, incredible kind of sculptures that people are visiting and seeing that look so different than the works that looked like this that they were protesting. The other thing I want you to know is that Hitler was also an artist, and while most people say he was not a great artist, he was certainly an accomplished artist in some ways. And so this is a piece from 1912 that Hitler did on the Vienna State Opera House. You can see the sort of traditional classical models that he liked. In the roof terrace, there are equestrian statues. There are sculptures in the rounded archways that so recall sort of that classical aesthetic. The piece on the right is from 1913, this Mother Mary with the Holy Christ Child, this kind of golden pastoral landscape with greenery, flowering petals, and the idea that there's no war, no sadness, no misery shown in this piece, but only a happy, sort of fulfilling image. Other pieces by Hitler were the courtyard of the old residency in Munich from 1914. Again, sort of a more classical representation of a traditional home here, or even this tree at a track by Adolf Hitler in 1911. It's a little more somber than some of his other pieces, but it certainly does not have kind of the level of abstraction, even though it looks like he's playing with some abstraction with the way he's depicted the leaves and the trunk of the tree. So this has been a presentation on the new objectivity and degenerate art movements, and I hope you've learned a lot about this time period and the works that were produced. Thank you.